Hey guys, welcome back to the Project B-Ball Breakdown. My name is Harsh Patel, and today we will be talking about Week 2 in the NFL. It all started with the Thursday Night Football game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns. The Browns edged the Bengals with a score of 35-30, giving the Cleveland Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski his first NFL victory. So congratulations to him. Baker Mayfield had 219 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. One of his touchdowns was to Odell Beckham Jr., who had 4 receptions and 74 yards. The main focus of their offense, though, was their running backs. Nick Chubb had 124 yards on 22 carries with 22 touchdowns, and his battery, Kareem Hunt, had a receiving touchdown to go along with the performance. On the other side of the ball, we had the number 1 pick in Joe Burrow, who had a great game with 316 yards and 3 touchdowns. One of them going to Tyler Boyd, who racked up 72 yards and 7 receptions. As in for their rushing attack, nothing really happened there. Joe Mixon only got 46 yards on the ground on 16 carries. The Bengals took an early lead with a Randy Bullock field goal, but that lead was quickly erased with a pair of touchdowns from Nick Chubb and the play of the game of Odell Beckham Jr.'s 43-yard touchdown pass from Baker Mayfield. After that touchdown pass to OBJ, the game was practically over, and the Cleveland Browns improved to 1-1, while the Cincinnati Bengals are still winless in the season at 0-2. So moving on to our Sunday games, we got the New York Giants at Chicago. The Bears beat the Giants with a score of 17-13, with Trubisky having an alright game of 190 yards with 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. One of his touchdowns was to his running back, David Montgomery, who racked up a total of 82 yards on the ground on 16 carries, as well as 3 receptions, 45 yards, and a touchdown to his name. On the other side of the ball, Daniel Jones didn't have the best game. He had 241 yards with no touchdowns and 1 interception. His leading receiver, his tight end, Evan Ingram, had 6 receptions on 65 yards. And the biggest story of the game was when Saquon Barkley got injured. At the moment, all we know is that he has a torn ACL and he is out for this season. So, get well soon, Saquon Barkley. Our next game, we had the Atlanta Falcons versus the Dallas Cowboys. This was the game of the week, with Atlanta losing to the Dallas Cowboys by 1 with a score of 39-40. Dak Prescott had a great game with 450 yards, 1 touchdown, and a pair of rushing touchdowns. His main receiver was the rookie out of Oklahoma, CeeDee Lamb, with 6 receptions and 106 yards. And Ezekiel Elliott, the running back, had a great game as well with 89 yards, a touchdown, and 22 carries. On the other side, we got Matt Ryan, who also had a phenomenal game with 4 touchdowns and 273 yards. 2 of his touchdowns were thrown to Calvin Ridley, who is continuing his great season with 7 receptions and 109 yards on Sunday. Todd Gurley had an alright game with 21 carries and 61 yards on the ground. The game started with 4 fumbles actually for the Dallas Cowboys in the first quarter. The Falcons capitalized on that and took an early 20-0 lead in the first. At half, the score was 29-10 Falcons, but the Dallas Cowboys slowly made their comeback with a key onside kick recover and eventually winning the game with a Greg Zuerlein 46-yard field goal at the buzzer. So our next game, we had the Detroit Lions versus the Green Bay Packers. This game was really all about the errands on Green Bay. Aaron Rodgers, their quarterback, had 240 yards and a pair of touchdowns, while their running back Aaron Jones had 168 yards on the ground, 2 running touchdowns, and He had 68 yards in the air with also a receiving touchdown. So the Arians getting it done for Green Bay. On the other side, Matthew Stafford didn't have the best game. He had 2 touchdowns, 1 pick, going along with 244 yards. His main receiver was his tight end, TJ Hawkinson, with 4 receptions and 62 yards. The Green Bay Packers improved to a record of 2-0, while the Detroit Lions are at the bottom of that division with a record of 0-2. Our next game was between the Tennessee Titans and the Jacksonville Jaguars. This was a great game as the Titans edged the Jacksonville Jaguars by 3 with the score of 33-30. Ryan Tannehill threw for 4 touchdowns, going along with his 239 yards. Two of his touchdowns went to Jonnu Smith, who had 84 yards on 4 receptions. Derrick Henry, or King Henry, had a decent game with 84 yards and 25 carries. On the other side, Minshew Mania, he had an up and down game. He had 3 touchdowns, but he also had 2 interceptions going along with his 339 yards. His main receiver, DJ Chark Jr., had 4 receptions and 84 yards. And their rushing leader, Robinson, had a touchdown along with his 102 yards on 16 carries. The game highlights was basically Tennessee jumping out to an early lead at half. They led 24-10 at half, but the Jacksonville Jaguars made a comeback in the 3rd and 4th quarters, but eventually lost the game on a Steven Gostkowski field goal with a minute left. The Titans improved to a record of 2-0, while Jacksonville fell to 1-1. The next game was a bit of a stinker between the Indianapolis Colts versus the Minnesota Vikings. The Colts beat the Vikings easily, 28-11. Kirk Cousins from Minnesota had probably his worst game as a professional, with only 113 yards and 3 interceptions, no touchdowns. His leading receiver was the rookie out of LSU, Justin Jefferson, who had 3 receptions and 44 yards. Dalvin Cook had a touchdown for Minnesota, and that's basically all of their offense in the game. Philip Rivers, on the other side, had 214 yards, a touchdown, and a pick, while the rookie out of Wisconsin, Jonathan Taylor, had a great game with 101 yards on the ground, going along with his first touchdown of his career. Next game, we got the Buffalo Bills versus the Miami Dolphins. This was also a really close game. Buffalo barely beat the Dolphins with a score of 31-28. Josh Allen, in my eyes, I think he had like the best game of his career. He had 4 touchdown passes along with his 417 yards, the most in week 2. Stephon Diggs, their new addition from Minnesota, got 8 receptions, 153 yards, and 1 touchdown. A great sign for the Buffalo fans, as these two are making it look easy out on the field. As for Miami, Ryan Fitzpatrick had a great game. He had 328 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. And his leading receiver actually was his tight end, Matt Gesicki, who had 130 yards, on 8 receptions with a touchdown. As in for the game, it was close from the very start. At halftime, it was 17-10 Buffalo, and they just kept battling back and forth until Buffalo won at the very end. Excuse me. Our next game, it was my San Francisco 49ers versus the New York Jets. The 49ers did beat the Jets, but this was a very bad game for the Niners. They lost a bunch of players due to injury. They lost Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo due to a high ankle sprain. They lost Nick Bosa and Solomon Thomas consecutively on the same plays, who both tore their ACL. Raheem Mostert left the game due to knee issues, as long as also with Tevin Coleman, who left the game with knee issues. George Kittle didn't play in this game. Richard Sherman didn't play in this game. So this team is just full of injuries right now, but they did pull through with an 18-point win against the Jets. As in for stats, Jimmy, before he left, had a great game actually. 131 yards on 2 touchdowns. He only threw 2 incompletions in the whole game. Raheem Mostert had 8 carries, 92 yards, and a touchdown. And Jimmy's main receiver was Kendrick Bourne, who had 4 receptions and 67 yards. As in for the Jets, not the best game, obviously. Sam Darnold only had 179 yards, and he did throw a touchdown pass. Frank Gore, the longtime San Francisco 49er, only had 63 yards on the ground on 21 carries. The next game, we got the Los Angeles Rams versus the Philadelphia Eagles. The Rams cruised to victory in this one by a score of 37-19. Carson Wentz had a very bad game, throwing 2 interceptions and no touchdowns. Miles Sanders was probably the only plus side for the Philadelphia Eagles offense, who had 95 yards and a rushing touchdown. As in for the Rams, they continued their dominance with Jared Goff throwing for 3 touchdowns, and their running back Henderson Jr. had a touchdown on the ground along with his 81 yards. Next game, we got the Denver Broncos versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Broncos by a score of 26-21, with Ben Roethlisberger throwing for 311 yards on 2 touchdowns with a pick. One of his touchdowns was to Deontay Johnson, who had 8 receptions, 92 yards. And James Conner, the running back, came back in form with 106 yards, a rushing touchdown on 16 carries. As in for the Broncos, sad news that Drew Lock has been injured and likely out for the season. Jake Driscoll, though, didn't have a bad game, but he had 2 touchdowns, 1 interception with 256 yards. His main receiver was Sutton with 3 receptions and 66 yards. And Melvin Gordon didn't have his best game, but he did have 70 yards on 19 carries. As in for the game, Pittsburgh jumped out to a 17-3 lead at half. Denver tried to come back, but proved to be too little too late at the end. Next game, we got Tampa Bay, or I could say Tampa Bay versus Carolina. Tampa Bay cruised to victory. Brady threw for a touchdown and a pick with 217 yards. His only touchdown came to Mike Evans, who had a phenomenal game with 104 yards on 7 receptions. And their newly equipped running back Leonard Fournette had 2 touchdowns, 103 yards on 12 carries on the ground. As in for Carolina, Teddy Bridgewater had an alright game, but he didn't have any touchdowns. He did have 2 interceptions though. Their main wide receiver, DJ Moore, had 8 receptions for 120 yards. But the scary thing for the Panthers is that Christian McCaffrey was injured in this game, and it is said that he will be out for multiple weeks. In this game, while he was in there, he did have 2 rushing touchdowns along with his 59 yards on 18 carries. Tampa Bay improved to 1-1 on the season, while Carolina dropped down to 0-2. Our next game was between the Washington football team and the Arizona Cardinals. Kyler Murray is continuing his dominant performance with he had 286 yards, a touchdown, and a pick. DeAndre Hopkins, his main target, had 68 yards, 8 receptions, and a touchdown. On the other side, Dwayne Haskins had 223 yards and a touchdown, with his only touchdown going to Terry McLaurin, who had 7 receptions and 125 yards. Murray did run for 2 additional touchdowns as they steamrolled the football team 30-15. The Cardinals improved to 2-0, while the Washington football team stands 1-1. Our next game, we had the Kansas City Chiefs versus the LA Chargers. This was probably Mahomes' worst game statistically wise, you could say. He had 302 yards with 2 touchdowns. His main receiver, Tyreek Hill, had 99 yards, 5 receptions, and 1 touchdown. They fell to an early lead. It was 14-6 at halftime in favor of the Chargers. But then in overtime, Kansas City did prove to be the better team. For the Chargers, they nominated Justin Herbert, their rookie out of Oregon, to be their starting quarterback. He had a great first game of his career with 311 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. His main target was Keenan Allen, who had 7 receptions for 96 yards. Our next game was the Baltimore Ravens versus the Houston Texans. This was all Baltimore from the start to finish with a score of 33-16. Lamar Jackson threw for 204 yards, 1 touchdown, and Gus Edwards, the running back, ran for 73 yards on 10 carries. Deshaun Watson continued his okay season with 275 yards, a touchdown, and a pick, with his running back only having 34 yards on 11 carries. That Baltimore defense was very scary, and they stopped the running attack. Our Sunday night football game, we had the Patriots versus the Seahawks. This was a great game. Came down to the final play where Cam Newton couldn't run it in for the win. The Seahawks won 35-30, with Russell Wilson continuing his MVP season with 5 touchdowns, 288 yards. One of his touchdowns did go to DK Metcalf, who had 4 receptions and 92 yards. On the other side, Cam Newton had 397 yards, a touchdown, and a pick, but also running for 2 rushing touchdowns to go along with his 47 rushing yards on 11 carries. His main receiver was Julian Edelman, who had a great game of 8 receptions and 179 yards. Our Monday night football game was a shocker to me, with the Las Vegas Raiders beating the New Orleans Saints. The Saints did not have Michael Thomas, but I still did think that they would somehow find a way to beat the Las Vegas Raiders. But Derek Carr had other things in mind by throwing 282 yards to go along with his 3 touchdowns. His main receiver, his star tight end, Darren Waller, had 103 yards, 1 touchdown on 12 receptions. Josh Jacobs, their sophomore running back, had 88 yards and on 27 carries. Drew Brees for the Saints didn't have his best game. Threw for 312 yards for a touchdown and an interception. The main bright spot for the offense, you could say, was Alvin Kamara, who had 79 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns to go along with his 95 receiving yards on 9 receptions. The Las Vegas Raiders improved to a record of 2-0, while the Saints are now 1-1. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I will catch you for Week 3's highlights.